Here is a dining room the way a 9-year-old sees it. From 3 feet off the floor, you do not see faces. You see hands. You see a wristwatch pushed halfway up a forearm, a wedding band that has gone tight, knuckles resting on a tablecloth. You see belt buckles, and the front edges of chairs and the underside of the table, where somebody has stuck a wad of gum in 1996, and nobody has ever found it. You see whose shoes are pointed at the door. You see a phone lying face up on a chair seat because a grown man wanted to be able to check it without anybody watching him check it. From up there, where the adults are, that room is a holiday. From down there, it is a weather system, and children are extremely good at reading weather. I'm Nathan, and the reason I want you standing at that height for the next hour is that everything that matters in this story was visible from 3 feet off the floor for about 6 years, and no adult in that family ever crouched down. A boy did the thing children do when nobody explains something to them. He went and found out. He was 9. He used stamps. There is a punch in this one, thrown across a Thanksgiving table by a man old enough to know better. And there is a telephone call 3 hours later from a voice nobody in that family had heard in years. Neither of those is the story. The story is the 50 years sitting between them, and a boy who priced a stamp at 60 cents and went and found out. Colson Weaver had been in the Army for 13 years by the November this happened, and in all 13 of them, nobody had ever asked him a question about it that he could not answer in one sentence. He fixed wheeled vehicles. Later, he taught other people to fix wheeled vehicles. For the last 2 years, he had worked a recruiting station in a strip mall in Tolliver, Nebraska, between a nail salon and a place that cashed checks, and his job was to sit across a laminate table from 17-year-olds and their mothers and tell them the truth in a way that did not sound like a sales pitch, which is harder than it sounds and which he was good at. He was 38. He had a flat, unhurried way of talking that made people assume he was slow until they had known him about a month. He had a bad left knee from a jack stand that failed in Fort Riley in his 20s, a habit of fixing other people's cars in his own driveway on Saturdays for nothing, and a 9-year-old son named Callan who collected postmarks. Erin Weaver had married him in a Lutheran church in Tolliver when she was 26 and he was 28, and she had spent most of the years since then in a quiet argument with the town she grew up in. She was a veterinary technician. She was good with frightened animals and less good with frightened people, which is a distinction that will matter later. They had come back to Tolliver because her mother needed a hip replaced and then needed a second one, and because Colson had a chance at the recruiting slot, and because Erin had said, in the kitchen of their rental in Kansas, a sentence she would think about for a long time afterward. It's 3 years. How bad can 3 years be? Her father was Ruston Denham, and to understand this story you have to understand exactly what Ruston Denham was, which is not what you are guessing. He was not rich. He had spent 31 years as a regional sales representative for a farm equipment distributor out of Grand Island, and he had done fine, and he had a paid-off house on Cotter Street, with a deck he had built himself and a den off the back of it. He had no political power. He did not own the sheriff or the bank or the newspaper. If you had asked anybody in Tolliver to list the important men in that county, Ruston Denham would not have been on the list. What he had was one thing, and he had all of it. Every year on the last Monday in May, at the cemetery on the north edge of town, Ruston Denham read the names. There were 62 of them on the granite, going back to 1918, and he read them the same way every year, slowly, with a pause after each one, wearing a garrison cap with a pin on it. And when he got to the 3 from Vietnam, his voice did a thing that people talked about afterward at the potluck. He had chaired the Tolliver Fallen Sons Fund since 1998, a scholarship that gave $2,000 a year to a graduating senior with a service connection in the family. He spoke at the middle school. He was the man the funeral home called when a veteran died, and the family did not know how to arrange the flag. In a town of 6,000 people, he was not a pillar. He was something more specific and more fragile than that. He was the custodian of one idea, and the idea was that Tolliver remembered. He had never liked Colson. It took Colson a while to work out that it was not personal, and then a while longer to work out that it was extremely personal, just not in the way he had assumed. The first sign came at the wedding. Ruston gave a toast that lasted 7 minutes and mentioned the groom twice. It was about service. It was about what it costs. It ended with a line about how not everybody who wears the uniform earns it, delivered with a smile, to a room that laughed because it thought it was a joke about civilians. After that it was small and constant. Ruston introduced him at church as Aaron's husband. He's in the army. He's a mechanic. He asked at every Christmas whether Colson had gotten overseas yet, in the tone you would use to ask a man in his 40s whether he had gotten around to college. When Colson deployed to Kuwait for 9 months in the 3rd year of the marriage, Ruston told people his son-in-law was in the rear with the gear, and when Colson came back and did not correct him, Ruston took it as confirmation instead of as manners. Colson let it go for a long time. Here is why. And I want to be honest about it because the story does not work if you think he was a saint. He let it go because letting it go was cheaper. A recruiter lives on the goodwill of a town. Ruston Denham knew everybody's mother. There was a version of Colson Weaver's life in that town where Ruston made 3 phone calls, and Colson spent 2 years explaining himself. And Colson could see that version clearly, and he steered around it the way you steer around a pothole you have hit before. Callan Weaver was 9 that fall and had the kind of quiet that adults mistake for shyness. He was not shy, he was busy. He had a shoebox with a rubber band around it that held every envelope that had ever come to the house addressed to him, and he had them in order, not by date, but by how far they had traveled, which he worked out from the postmark. His prize was a card from a cousin of Aaron's stationed in Okinawa. He knew the difference between a hand cancel and a machine cancel. He could tell you which post offices in Nebraska still did their own canceling and which ones sent everything to Omaha. He had one other quality, and his father had noticed it and never named it out loud. Callan did not accept an unanswered question. If you told him the sky was blue because of the air, he would want to know which part of the air, and he would keep the question in his pocket for 3 weeks and bring it back out at dinner, word for word, exactly as you had left it. That is the entire mechanism of what happened. There is no genius child in this story. There is a kid who liked mail and could not let a question go. The 2 families had a rhythm by then. Sunday dinner at the Denham house maybe twice a month. Birthdays, the summer thing at the reservoir, Thanksgiving. Kathleen Denham, Aaron's mother, cooked in enormous quantities and apologized the whole time. Braxton Denham, Aaron's younger brother, was 34, ran a print and sign shop on the highway that his father had co-signed for, and had the particular loudness of a man who has never once had to be right on his own. And every gathering had a shape, which was that at some point the room would arrange itself around Ruston, and Ruston would tell one of the stories. There were about 7 of them in rotation. Colson had heard all 7. The best one, the one people asked for, was the river crossing. It went like this. February of 1970. A company strung out along a river, the name of which Ruston pronounced with a confidence nobody in Tolliver could check, and the lead element caught on the far bank, and a 19-year-old from Ord, Nebraska, named Denny Sutcliffe, went down in the water, and Ruston went in after him with his boots on, and got a hand into the back of his collar and pulled him 20 yards downstream to a gravel bar, and lay there with him while the world came apart above them. Denny Sutcliffe lived until 2004, and ran a bait shop outside Ord, and did not talk about it, which the story always mentioned. When Ruston told it, he told it plainly, no shouting, and he always ended on the same detail. The water was so cold it did not feel like water, it felt like being held. I have to tell you that it is a good story. That is not a small thing. That story is the reason a whole town gave one man a place in it for 50 years. The last piece of the setup is a man almost nobody in this story ever saw. Ruston had an older brother named Wilkes Denham, 74 that year, who lived 38 minutes away outside a place called Renner Crossing, in a single-wide trailer parked behind a closed implement dealership that he had once, briefly, owned a third of. He did not come to Thanksgiving. He did not come to birthdays. He had come to Aaron's wedding and left before the meal. The family's account of Wilkes was economical and had not changed in Aaron's lifetime. Wilkes drank. Wilkes could not keep hold of anything. Wilkes had been given every chance. Kathleen said it with pity. Braxton said it with contempt. Ruston, and this is the part Colson would think about later, did not say it at all. Ruston sent money. Everyone knew Ruston sent money, because Kathleen mentioned it about twice a year in the tone of a woman reading out a debt that would never be repaid, and Ruston would say, every time, The same 6 words. He's my brother. That's the end of it. Callan had met Wilkes once, at Kathleen's mother's funeral, when he was 6. Wilkes had sat outside on the steps of the funeral home with a paper cup of coffee, and Callan had sat next to him for about 20 minutes. And afterward, in the car, Callan had said that the old man had asked him what he was interested in and had listened to the whole answer. He remembered that for 3 years. He remembered it because it was rare. School started that year on a Wednesday, and in the second week of September, a 4th-grade teacher named Tracy Kirkland handed out an assignment sheet that she had used, in some form, for 6 years, and that had never once caused anybody any trouble. It was called Living History. Each student was to choose one person in their family who had served in the military, or, if there was nobody, one person from Tolliver on the cemetery granite. They were to interview that person, or the family of that person. They were to write to at least one organization that keeps records. The sheet listed the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, the State Historical Society, unit associations, the county museum, and include whatever came back. And on the second Tuesday of November, before the Veterans Day Assembly, the boards would go up along the gym wall for the parents to walk past. Ms. Kirkland was proud of the assignment. She had good reasons. Kids who will not write a paragraph about themselves will write 4 pages about a great-uncle. The letter-writing part was the piece she had added later, because she had noticed that children treat a real envelope going to a real building as a serious act, and they should. Colson Weaver read the sheet twice on the bus and had made his decision before he got to the driveway. He did not choose his father. Colson found out about that the way you find out about most things a 9-year-old decides, which is sideways, 3 days later, from his wife. Erin told him in the kitchen while she was rinsing a pan, and she told him gently, which made it worse. Callan had chosen his grandfather, because, Callan had explained, Dad's job you can just ask Dad, and Grandpa's is history. I want to sit on that for 1 second, because it is the small wound the whole story grows out of. Colson Weaver had spent 13 years in the Army, being extremely competent at an unglamorous job, and the only person in the world whose opinion he actually wanted had looked at the 2 men available and classified one of them as history and one of them as available. He said, "That's good, that's a good pick." And he meant it, and he also carried it around for 2 months. Callan started that Saturday. He interviewed his grandfather at the kitchen table on Cotter Street with a spiral notebook and a list of 17 questions he had written out the night before, and Ruston Denham gave him an hour and a half, which was, by every account, the best hour and a half those 2 ever spent together. Kathleen took a picture of it. Ruston talked about the heat and the smell and the mail. He told the river crossing story, and Callan wrote down the name Denny Sutcliffe with the correct spelling because he asked for it twice. The trouble started with question 14, which was not a trick and which any child would ask. What was your unit? There is a version of that question that is a warm invitation to a man like Ruston Denham, and he answered it that way, expansively, with a division and a nickname and a hand-drawn patch in the margin of Callan's notebook. And then Callan, who had the assignment sheet in his folder and who intended to do the assignment correctly, asked the second half of it. How do you spell it, and what were the numbers? The letter place needs the numbers. Kathleen, later, would remember that her husband's face did something she had seen maybe 3 times in 50 years of marriage. He said the numbers. Then he said them again differently. Then he told his grandson that the records place was a waste of a stamp, that half those files burned in a fire in the 70s, which is a true fact about the 1973 St. Louis fire and was, in that kitchen, on that afternoon, a piece of extraordinarily fast thinking. He said the interview was the assignment. He said the letters were busy work. And Colson Weaver, 9 years old, sitting at his grandmother's kitchen table, wrote down the numbers his grandfather had said the first time, because those were the ones he had said first, and put a small question mark next to them, because his teacher had told them to mark anything they were not sure about. He mailed the first 3 letters on the 23rd of September, St. Louis, the Division Association, whose address he found in the back of a book at the county museum. The Tolliver Clarion, asking whether they had anything in the archive about the town's men from 1969 and 1970. He paid for the stamps out of a mason jar in his room. He walked to the post office himself, which in Tolliver is a thing a 9-year-old can do, and he asked the clerk, because he was Callan, whether she would hand cancel them, And she did, and he watched. Nobody in that family thought about it again for 26 days. The first envelope came back on the 17th of October, and it was the one from St. Louis, and it was a form. Callan read it at the kitchen counter with his backpack still on. It said, in the flat language those letters use, that a search of the records under the name and service number provided had not located a file, and that the requester should verify the information and resubmit, and that if the veteran served in the period affected by the 1973 fire, reconstruction might be possible from alternate sources. And here were 3 checkboxes. He was not upset. He was 9. And to a 9-year-old, a form that tells you to try again is not a verdict. It is an instruction. He put it in the shoebox. He copied the address for the alternate sources request. And he did the thing that was going to take a 50-year-old arrangement apart, which was that he circled the word verify with a pencil and went and got the notebook and looked at his own question mark. 2 days later, the second letter came, and it was not a form. Joanna Hargrave had been the volunteer archivist for a division association for 6 years, and she answered every letter, and she was particularly careful with the ones from children because there had been a stretch in the 90s when the association's answers to kids had been curt, and it had cost them a generation. She wrote to Colson Weaver on association letterhead, a page and a half, typed. She thanked him. She said his handwriting was better than most of the adults who wrote to her. She said that she had checked the numbers he had sent against the rosters she had, and that she was not able to place his grandfather in that unit in that period, and that this was very common and could mean many things: transfers, attachments, clerical error, or simply that the numbers had gotten garbled somewhere between his grandfather's memory and his notebook, which happens to all of us. She asked him to send the exact spelling of the name, any dates he had, and, if he had one, a photograph. And then, because she was thorough, and because he had mentioned in his letter that his family was from Tolliver, Nebraska, she added a paragraph that she would think about for the rest of her life. She wrote that she did have a Denham from Tolliver, Nebraska, in her rosters. First name Wilkes. In country, from March 1969 to June 1970. And that she was including his roster line in case it was helpful, and that if that was a relative, the association would love to hear from him, because there was an oral history project and very few of that group were still living. Colson Weaver put the 2 letters side by side on the kitchen counter. He did not tell his parents. This is the part where adults always want to shout at the child, and I would ask you not to. He did not tell them because he had not found anything yet. He had found a discrepancy, and a 9-year-old with a discrepancy does not have a theory. He has homework. He wrote back to Joanna Hargrave the same evening with the name spelled out and a photocopy of a photograph he took off the wall in his grandfather's den and put back before dinner, and he asked her one question at the bottom, in his own words, underlined twice. Do you know Wilkes Denham? He is my grandpa's brother. Is he the same one? 11 days later, he got a letter from a man in Ord, Nebraska, named Gerard Mullins, who was 79, because Joanna Hargrave had done what associations do, which is forward things. Gerard Mullins wrote in ballpoint on both sides of 2 sheets of lined paper, and his hand shook, and he apologized for it in the first line. He said the association lady had sent him the boy's letter. He said he had been trying for 2 days to work out how to answer it, and had decided the only way was to answer the question that was asked. He said, I did not know a Ruston Denham. I remember your Uncle Wilkes very well. He wrote about him for a page and a half. He said Wilkes Denham was a quiet one, that he had a way of taking the worst detail without making a speech about it, that he could not sing and sang anyway. He wrote that on a night in February of 1970, he had watched Wilkes Denham go into a river that was moving faster than it looked, and come out of it with Denny Sutcliffe by the collar, and lie on the gravel with him for what Gerard Mullins estimated at a quarter of an hour, and that afterward Wilkes could not get warm for a day and a half, and made a joke about it that Gerard Mullins still remembered word for word and did not put in the letter because there was a child reading it. He closed by saying that he hoped the boy would write again, and that if his uncle was living, he would very much like an address. Colson Weaver read that letter in his bedroom with the door shut. He was 9 years old. He did not understand most of what it meant. He understood one thing with total clarity, the way children understand exactly the thing you would rather they did not. The best story his grandfather told about himself had happened to somebody else. And the somebody else was the man on the funeral home steps who had listened to his whole answer. He did not go to his mother. He did not go to his father. He went to the one place a kid who trusts mail would go. He wrote to Wilkes Denham, Renner Crossing, Nebraska, and he asked him, in 4 sentences, whether he had pulled a man named Denny Sutcliffe out of a river. Wilkes Denham's reply came back in 6 days, on a piece of paper torn out of a spiral notebook, and it was 2 lines long. Some things get told wrong for a long time, and it is nobody's fault by now. Please stop asking. Your Uncle Wilkes. If you have been waiting for the moment where a 9-year-old should have stopped, that was it. And I want to be fair to him. He did stop, for 6 days. Then he wrote back and asked why. The Veterans Day Assembly at Tolliver Elementary was the 2nd Tuesday of November, and the boards went up along the gym wall the afternoon before. Callan's board was, by the standards of 4th grade, magnificent. He had the photograph from the den, enlarged at the print shop that Ruston Denham owned, which is a detail that is going to matter in a minute. He had the interview typed out. He had the association's letter with the roster line, and the St. Louis form, and Gerard Mullins's 2 pages photocopied and mounted, and at the top, in careful letters, a title he had chosen himself, The River, and who was in it. He had not accused anybody of anything. There was no arrow, no red circle. It was, in fact, a beautifully honest piece of 4th grade work. Here is what my grandfather told me. Here is what the records say. Here is what a man who was there says. And here is my question at the bottom, which was, how do you find out which one is right? Ruston Denham came to the assembly. He came every year. He read a short thing at the end. He was introduced by the principal. He wore the cap. He walked the line of boards with Kathleen before it started, the way parents do, at that slow shuffle. And he stopped in front of his grandson's board and he read it. And he did not move for a while. Nobody in the gym noticed anything. That is the part people never believe. There was no scene. He read the board, and he put his hand on the top of the display and straightened it, which everybody who saw it read as pride, and he went and sat in the 2nd row and, 20 minutes later, read a short thing about the meaning of the day, and his voice did the thing it did. Then he went out to the parking lot and stood by his car until Aaron came out, and he told his daughter that the board was coming down. Aaron, who had not read the board closely, and who had spent 36 years learning to move her father off a topic, said something about how it was up for 2 days. He said it was coming down that night. She asked why, and her father, in a school parking lot, with people walking past, said a sentence that she took home and could not put anywhere. Your son is being used by somebody. That night the family telephone system did what it did. Kathleen called Aaron and cried a little and said her father had a headache and was very upset, and that the boy had gotten hold of some things that were half true, and that it was cruel, at his age, to have a grandchild going behind him. Braxton called Colson, which he never did, and opened with, "Hey, so weird one," and explained that the enlargement Callan had brought into his shop had a bunch of stuff with it, and that he probably should have flagged it, and then said the sentence that told Colson where this was going. Dad's asking me who else has seen it. Colson Weaver sat on the edge of his own bed with the phone in his hand and understood, for the first time, that he was in something. He went and asked his son. He did it carefully, at the kitchen table, in the way he had learned to ask 17-year-olds hard questions without closing them up. And Callan showed him the shoebox. Not the postmark shoebox, a second one, 31 envelopes, in order, with the letters folded back inside the envelopes they came in, because that is how you keep a postmark intact. St. Louis, the Association, the Clarion, which had sent a cheerful note and 2 photocopies of pages from 1970 that showed nothing. Gerard Mullins, twice, and Wilkes Denham, twice, the second one longer than the first and even worse. I am asking you as a favor, and you do not owe me any favors. Colson read all of it standing up, and then sat down, and then read the Mullins letter again. Here is what he did not do, and it is the reason this story ends the way it does. He did not go to Cotter Street that night. He did not call his father-in-law. He did not tell his wife. What he did was ask his son one question. Does anybody at school know? Callan said no. The board had been up for one afternoon and nobody reads them. Okay, Colson said. Then it's not a secret. It's just not finished. 10 days later, on a Thursday, in the 3rd week of November, Staff Sergeant Weaver was called in to the battalion office in Lincoln to answer an allegation. Someone had written to the recruiting battalion, typed, unsigned, mailed from Omaha, alleging that recruiter Weaver had coached an applicant to conceal a juvenile citation and a prescription on his medical pre-screen. It named the applicant, a 19-year-old from Tolliver named Marsh Talley who had shipped in August. I want to explain why this was serious, because it does not sound serious. Recruiting is one of the few jobs in the Army where an anonymous letter is enough to end you. Improper enlistment allegations go straight to a formal inquiry. The recruiter is pulled off production. His files are pulled for a year back, and even when it is nothing, the finding lives in a folder. His captain, who liked him, told him it plainly. You'll be fine. It'll take 3 months and you'll be fine. 3 months is a long time to be fine. Colson drove back from Lincoln on Highway 6 in the dark and did the arithmetic. He knew what Ruston Denham did and did not have. He did not have money or a badge. What he had was a room full of people who believed him on sight, and 40 years of knowing which office to call, and a son with a print shop and a copier. He did not have proof of anything. He understood, driving home, that he was never going to get proof of it, and that this was the actual shape of the thing. A man who had spent 50 years being believed had discovered that a 9-year-old was going to make him be checked, and had reached for the only lever he had, which was Colson's job. Erin was up when he got in. He told her about the inquiry. He did not tell her the rest. She said, "Dad wouldn't do that." He said, "Okay," and that okay is the moment their marriage cracked, 6 days before Thanksgiving, and both of them knew it. The Denham Thanksgiving had a seating chart, an actual one, in Kathleen's handwriting, because she had been doing it since 1994, and because it prevented arguments. There were 13 at the table that year, Ruston at the head, under the shelf with the folded flag on it. Kathleen at the kitchen end where she could get up, Braxton and his wife and their 2. An aunt from Kearney and her husband, who were both hard of hearing. A neighbor couple from Cotter Street who came every year because their kids were in Denver. Erin, Colson, and Callan at the corner by the sideboard where a 9-year-old goes. Colson had not wanted to go. Erin had said one sentence about it that was fair and that he could not argue with. If we don't go, it's a story, and the story is about us. It went well for 50 minutes. This is the part nobody tells right. It went genuinely well. The food was good. The aunt from Kearney told the same joke she tells. Braxton's youngest fell off a chair and was fine. And Ruston Denham was in a good mood. And a good mood on that man was warm and generous and took up the whole room. Then the plates were being pushed back, and Ruston stood, glass in hand, and did the thing he did every year, which was a short and honestly rather beautiful speech about the people who could not be at tables. And at the end of it, still standing, still warm, he said, "And I want to say, since we're all here, we're keeping Colson in our thoughts. He's got something going on at work, an investigation, and whatever it turns out to be, this family stands behind him. There are perhaps 20 seconds in this story that decide it, and those were the first of them. The table did the thing a table does." The neighbor woman said, "Oh no." The aunt said, "What?" too loudly. Braxton looked at his plate with the specific stillness of a man who already knew. Kathleen said, "Ruston." Erin's face went white in a way that Colson, who had been married to her for 13 years, had seen exactly once before, at a vet clinic, holding a dog. And Colson Weaver, who had spent 2 years steering around this pothole, put his napkin on the table and said, evenly, to the whole room, "It's an anonymous letter about a kid I enlisted in August. It'll be closed by February. Marsh Talley's a good kid, and he told the truth on his paperwork, and whoever wrote it knows that." He looked at his father-in-law when he said the last part, not hard. Just looked, and that would have been the end of it. A bad Thanksgiving, a story they'd tell in 5 years, except that Callan Weaver, 9, sitting at the corner by the sideboard, heard the words, "told the truth," and whoever wrote it, and understood approximately none of it, and felt the room, and did what he had been doing for 2 months, which was try to help by supplying the fact he had. He said, into the quiet, in a completely ordinary voice, "Mr. Mullins says you weren't there, Grandpa. He says it was Uncle Wilkes in the river. I was going to ask you, but Grandma said not to." Ruston Denham hit Colson Weaver twice. Not the boy. I need to be clear about that, and so does everybody who told this story afterward. He came around the corner of that table faster than a 68-year-old man should be able to, and he hit his son-in-law once in the mouth while Colson was still sitting down. And then, when Colson stood up and did not raise his hands, he hit him again on the cheekbone, and the second one is the one that opened the skin, and the second one is also the one that everybody in that room understood, because the first one you can tell yourself was rage, and the second one was a man trying to make somebody fight him so that it would be a fight instead of what it was. Colson Weaver did not hit him back, not out of nobility. He told me later, and I believe him, that what went through his head was flat and practical and had two parts. This man is 68, and I am a soldier in a room with 12 witnesses. He stood there with his hands at his sides, and blood coming down into the collar of a shirt Aaron had ironed, and Ruston Denham stood 18 inches away and said, loud, to the room as much as to him, "You're nothing but a soldier's uniform." And then he turned and pointed at the corner by the sideboard, at his own grandson, and said, "Take that little mistake and get out of my house." 13 people heard it. Nobody moved. Kathleen made a sound. Braxton stood up and did not do anything. The aunt from Kearney asked her husband what had been said, and he told her, and she said, "Oh, Ruston." And that was the only sentence spoken in that room in defense of a 9-year-old. And Aaron Weaver stayed in her chair. That is the second 20 seconds. She would spend a year on those. She was 36 years old, and she had spent every one of those years in a house with a rule in it. And the rule was that her father recovered from things, and everyone helped him do it. And she sat there with her hands in her lap while her husband bled, and her son was called a mistake. And what she felt, she said later, was not loyalty and not fear. It was the total physical certainty that if she stood up, the family ended. Which was true. She just had the arithmetic backwards about who was ending it. Callan Weaver got out of his chair. He walked the length of that table past all of them. He took his father's hand, which he had not done in public since he was 6, and he pulled on it, once, and he said, quietly, into a silent room, "Let's go, Daddy. They don't know what I did." They drove 8 minutes across town in the truck without the radio on. Colson had a dish towel from Kathleen's kitchen against his cheek that he had picked up on the way out, because a man who fixes things picks up a rag. He said, "Buddy, what did you do?" And Callan, looking out the window, said, "I wrote to people." It was 6:40 in the evening. At 9:38 that night, the landline in the Weaver's rental on Peel Street rang, and Colson Weaver, sitting at his own kitchen table with a bag of frozen corn on his face and a shoebox open in front of him, picked it up. The voice was old and slow and had to stop twice. "This is Wilkes Denham. Is this Aaron's husband?" "Yes, sir." "Are you all right?" Kathleen called me. She called me, which she has not done since 1998. "I'm all right." And then Wilkes Denham said the sentence, "Please tell your son to stop it. Please. I'm asking you." Colson Weaver drove out to Renner Crossing that night, with his son asleep across the bench seat under a coat, because he was not going to leave him with anybody, and because Aaron was not home yet. The trailer sat behind the shell of an implement dealership with a hand-painted sign still on it. There was a light on over the door. Wilkes Denham was 74 and did not look like his brother in any way that mattered. Narrow, stooped, with hands that had done outdoor work for 50 years and a way of standing in a doorway as if he expected to be asked to leave it. He looked at Colson's face, at the tape over the cheekbone, and he said, "He did that. Yes, with people watching. Yes." Wilkes Denham stood in that doorway for a long moment and then said, "You better come in then, and don't wake the boy." What he told Colson over the next 3 hours, at a table with a burn ring in it, is the actual center of this story, and it is not what a courtroom would call a confession. It was a man explaining how a thing happened over 50 years, one small reasonable step at a time, which is how everything that looks monstrous from outside actually happens. He went in March of 1969 and came home in June of 1970, and there was nothing dramatic about either. He came back to Tolliver 26 years old and weighing 131 pounds and unable to sleep in a room with the door shut. And he went to work at the implement place, and he did not talk about it, because in 1970, in Nebraska, that is what you did, and because the specific things he had to say were not sayable at a supper table. Ruston was 3 years younger and had not gone. Not out of cowardice, and Wilkes was careful about this. Ruston had a punctured eardrum from a childhood infection and was classified out, twice, and had also, that same year, been the one who stayed and ran their father's route when their father's heart went bad. Wilkes said, more than once that night, he didn't dodge anything. That's the part people are going to get wrong. What happened instead was smaller and worse. Ruston wrote to his brother every week for 16 months, and he was proud of him in a way that was loud, and around Tolliver, he talked about it constantly. Our boy, we got a letter this week. We're over there. And Tolliver, which was not paying close attention, and which had 2 Denham brothers and 1 uniform between them, gradually got it turned around. Not all at once, over years. The first time somebody said it to Ruston's face, a man at a filling station in 1972, saying thank you for your service, shaking his hand, he did not correct it. That is the whole crime, and it took 2 seconds, and Wilkes said his brother had told him about it that same night, laughing, embarrassed, saying, I didn't know what to say to the guy. The second time he did not correct it either. By their mother's funeral in 1974, Ruston Denham told the river crossing story at the reception, in the first person, to a room of 30 people including his own brother, and Wilkes Denham, 28 years old, standing by a table of ham sandwiches, said nothing. Colson asked him the only question worth asking. Why? And Wilkes Denham gave him 3 answers, and they got worse as they went. The first was that he did not want it. Any of it. He said that in 1974 he could not be in a room where people were looking at him and thinking about that river, and that when his brother took the story he felt, and he used this word, relieved. He wanted it and I couldn't hold it. It was like handing somebody a hot pan. The second was that by 1980, it was too late to be a mistake, and had become a lie, and a lie that old does not have a door in it. Correcting it in 1980 would not have meant, actually it was me. It would have meant, my brother has been lying to this town for 6 years, and I let him. And that sentence takes 2 men down, and one of them had a wife and 2 kids, and a job that depended on people liking him. The third answer was the one that took a while to get out of him, and it came out at about 1 in the morning. In 1983, Wilkes Denham's wife got sick, and it took 19 months, and there was no insurance worth the name, and at the end of it, he was 39 years old, with a folder of bills that came to more than the trailer and the truck and the third of the dealership put together. And Ruston paid them, not all at once, not with a speech. He just paid them, over 3 years, and never once mentioned it. And then he kept paying. Rent, when there was no rent. The truck, twice. A propane bill in 2009. Every single one of those payments arrived without a word attached, and every single one of them was a brick in a wall. And Wilkes Denham had lived his whole adult life behind that wall. And he described it to Colson Weaver, at 1 in the morning, in a way I have not been able to stop thinking about since. He never asked me for anything. Not one time in 50 years. That's how you do it, son. If he'd ever asked, I could have said no. That is inherited obligation, and it is the most efficient prison anybody has ever built, and it does not require a single dishonest man to construct it. Then Wilkes told him the part that made him a defendant instead of a victim. In 2011, the county in Nebraska where Tolliver sits administered a homestead property tax exemption with a disabled veteran category, and Ruston Denham applied for it, and the application required documentation, and what got submitted with it was a copy of a DD-214, the discharge document, belonging to Wilkes Denham, with a supporting affidavit signed by Wilkes Denham attesting that the information in the application was true. Wilkes had signed it at that table. Ruston had brought it out in a folder with 3 other things in it: insurance forms, a beneficiary change, the ordinary paper of an aging family, and Wilkes had signed all 4 without reading them, because his brother had asked him to, and his brother had never asked him for anything. He worked it out 18 months later, and that is why, when a 9-year-old with a shoebox and a fistful of stamps started writing to a division association, a 74-year-old man in a trailer picked up a telephone at 9:38 on Thanksgiving night and begged a stranger to make him stop. Not because he was protecting his brother, because in the whole state of Nebraska there was exactly 1 document with the wrong man's service on it, and it had Wilkes Denham's signature at the bottom. Colson Weaver drove home at 4 in the morning with his son asleep beside him, and did not sleep at all. And by the time the sun came up, he had understood the shape of it, which was this: Everybody involved was trapped by the same lie, and the trap only worked because every person in it believed the only way out was to accuse somebody. Erin was at the kitchen table when he came in. She had been there since 2. She had not gone to Cotter Street after they left. She had sat in her mother's kitchen for 40 minutes, and then driven around the Reservoir Road for 3 hours, which is what she did instead of crying. He told her all of it. He did it badly, in the wrong order, exhausted. When he got to the part about the affidavit, she put both hands flat on the table. Then she said, "Say the part about 1974 again." He said it again, and Ruston Denham Weaver, 36, said, "My grandmother's funeral." And then, after a while, he told that story at my wedding. She went to see her mother at 9 that morning, and what happened in that house is the piece of this that I think about when people ask me whether these families ever really change. Kathleen Denham, 70, made coffee and did not sit down, and Erin asked her one question, which was, "When did you know?" And Kathleen Denham said, "Sit down, honey," and then told her daughter that she had known since 1974, that she had been at that reception, that she had watched Wilkes stand by the sandwiches, and that she had decided that afternoon that it was between the 2 brothers, and not for her, and that she had held that decision for 50 years, the way you hold a heavy dish you cannot put down without breaking it. Erin asked whether her father had written the letter to the army. Kathleen said, "He was on the phone with Brax for an hour on the 9th. That was all she said. It was enough, and it was also, Erin understood, the most disloyal sentence her mother had ever spoken in her life, and it had taken 50 years and a bleeding son-in-law to get it out of her. Here is where Colson Weaver did the thing that makes him worth telling a story about, and I want you to notice that it is not dramatic and there is no confrontation in it. He did not go to the newspaper. He did not go to the Legion. He did not print Gerard Mullins's letter and hand it around Tolliver, which he could have done in an afternoon and which would have felt tremendous. He had watched, at close range, what one anonymous letter had done to his own life, and he had exactly zero interest in becoming the man who wrote one. What he did instead was go back out to Renner Crossing on the Saturday and tell Wilkes Denham 2 true things. The first, you are not going to have to accuse him of anything. Nobody is going to make you say a word about 1970. The second, and he said this at the same table, with the burn ring in it, the exemption recertifies every year. It's a form. It's due the 31st of December. You don't have to sign a new thing saying he lied. You just have to not sign a new thing saying he didn't. There is a distinction there that a lawyer would call the difference between an affirmative act and an omission, and that a 74-year-old man in a trailer heard as something else entirely, which is, you can stop without becoming the kind of person who does that to his brother. Wilkes Denham said no that Saturday. He said no again on the Tuesday. What changed his mind was not Colson. It was a letter, because of course it was. Gerard Mullins, 79, of Ord, Nebraska, having finally gotten an address out of Joanna Hargrave, wrote to Wilkes Denham in the first week of December, and the letter was 4 sentences long, and Wilkes read it to Colson over the phone in a voice that kept going. It said that he had thought Wilkes was dead. It said that Denny Sutcliffe had asked about him every year until he died in 2004. It said that there was a reunion in Cheyenne in June, and that 11 of them were left. And it said, "You do not owe anybody an explanation for the last 50 years. You owe me a phone call." On the 29th of December, Wilkes Denham did not mail a form. That is the entire act. A man in his 70s did not put an envelope in a mailbox. What happened after that was slow and procedural, and involved almost nobody with a personality, which is how these things actually go. In the second week of February, the county assessor's office in Wickfield County sent Ruston Denham a standard notice that his homestead exemption could not be continued because the supporting affidavit had not been re-executed, and that he could either submit a new one or provide alternate documentation of the qualifying service, and that failure to respond within 30 days would result in the exemption being removed and the prior year's benefit being subject to review. I want you to understand how small that letter was. It was a form letter. It was signed by nobody. The clerk who processed it was 23 years old, and Ruston Denham, who had not been questioned about anything in 50 years, who had spent 5 decades in a town where the answer was always yes, did what men like him do when a machine asks them a question. He did not call a lawyer. He did not quietly let the exemption go, which is what any careful man would have done, and which would have ended this story with nothing but a slightly higher tax bill. He answered it, at length, in his own hand, on 3 sheets of paper, attached to the county's form. He wrote out his service. He wrote out the dates. He wrote out the unit and, because he could not help himself, because it was the best thing he had and he had been telling it for 50 years to rooms that loved him for it, he wrote out the river crossing, the cold water, the gravel bar, Denny Sutcliffe's collar. He named him, and he signed it, under a line of pre-printed type that said the statements above were made under penalty of law. The county assessor's office is not staffed by investigators. What that office does when a claim is contested is refer it, and where it refers it is to the county attorney. And what the county attorney does with a 50-year-old service claim is what anybody would do in 2026, which is spend $20 and an afternoon. A records request to St. Louis, a phone call to the Division Association whose name the claimant had helpfully written on the form, and a conversation with a volunteer archivist named Joanna Hargrave, who had a roster line, a photograph a 9-year-old had mailed her in October, and the address of a 79-year-old man in Ord who had already written the whole thing down once for a child. The charges, when they came in April, were not about Vietnam. They never are. It was a theft by deception count for the exemption, 19 years of it, $37,000 and change, and a second count that came out of the review that the first one triggered, which was the Tolliver Fallen Sons Fund, where 2 decades of an unaudited scholarship account run by one signatory turned out to have about $6,000 in personal charges threaded through it, none of them large, the largest being a set of tires. That is the whole downfall. There was no courtroom scene. There was no gym full of people. Ruston Denham took a plea in September, paid restitution, got probation and community service, and the Tolliver Clarion ran it under the fold at the bottom of page 3 in 2 paragraphs. What actually ended him was smaller than the charges and took about a week. In the last week of May, the Memorial Day Committee, which is 6 people, met to plan the cemetery service, and nobody proposed him, and nobody argued about it, and a retired principal read the 62 names, and read them badly, and that was that. Colson Weaver saw his father-in-law once during all of it, in the hallway of the Wickfield County Courthouse in April, outside a door, both of them waiting for different things. Ruston Denham had lost weight. He looked at the tape that was no longer on his son-in-law's cheek, at the place where it had been, and he did not apologize, and Colson had not expected him to. What he did was ask for something. He said, "Think about Erin. Think about what this does to her. You could still stop this." And there it was. 50 years later, in a hallway, offered to a new man, the hot pan. The same transaction he had made with his brother in 1974, which was not a threat and never had been. It was an invitation to be a good man about it, to take the weight, to be the one who holds it so that somebody else does not have to. Colson Weaver said, "It's not mine to stop. It never was. It was Wilkes's, and he put it down." And then he said the only cruel thing he said in the entire story, and he said it evenly, and I do not think it was cruel. You had a brother who'd have taken a beating for you, and instead you had him sign things. You want to know what I am? I'm a guy who fixes trucks. You should have been afraid of the kid. The inquiry into Staff Sergeant Weaver closed in the 3rd week of January, and it closed for the dullest possible reason. Marsh Talley, 19, home on leave, walked into the battalion office in Lincoln without being asked to by anybody, because his mother had heard something at church and told him, and he sat down and told a captain exactly what had happened in that strip mall in August, which was that he had disclosed everything on his own paperwork, and that Sergeant Weaver had made him call his mother from the office and tell her about the citation before they filed anything. Nobody ever proved who mailed the anonymous letter. Braxton Denham sold the print shop the following year and moved to Grand Island. That is the closest thing to an answer anybody got. Erin Weaver moved back into the house on Peel Street on the 6th of December, which is to say she had been gone for a week and a half, and I am not going to pretend that fixed anything quickly. What I know is that she did not go back to Cotter Street for a year, that she and her mother talk now, carefully, on Sundays, and that the sentence she says about it when people ask is, "I was in the chair for about a second and a half. It felt like the rest of my life." Callan Weaver did not learn most of what is in this story for about 2 years, and when he did, he took it the way he took the form letter from St. Louis. as an instruction rather than a verdict. The next November, when the living history boards went up along the gym wall at Tolliver Elementary, there was one about a man who went into a river in February of 1970 and pulled a 19-year-old out of it by the collar. It had a photograph on it that Gerard Mullins had mailed from Ord, and a roster line, and a typed page of an interview conducted at a table with a burn ring in it by a 10-year-old with a spiral notebook and 23 questions. Wilkes Denham came to the assembly. He sat in the second row, in a jacket, which is a thing he had not done in a while, and when the principal read out the names of the veterans present, he stood up for about a second and a half and sat back down, and a room of fourth graders clapped for a man in a trailer behind a closed implement dealership. He went to Cheyenne in June. 7 of them made it. There is a photograph. And on a Tuesday in February, in an office in the Wickfield County Administration Building, a 23-year-old named Megan Talley, no relation that anybody ever bothered to trace, though in a county that size there is always a relation, took a 3-page handwritten attachment off the top of her intake pile, decided it was above her pay grade, stamped it, and put it in the tray for the county attorney's courier, and thought about lunch. She has no idea. She still has no idea. She processed the piece of paper that took a 50-year-old lie apart, and to her it was a Tuesday, and I love that, and I think it is true of almost everything. So what do I take out of this one? Not the punch. The punch is the thumbnail, and I put it there honestly, but a man throwing a fist at a table is the least interesting thing that happened in this story. Here is what I actually cannot get past. Nobody in this story is a monster, and it still cost 50 years. Ruston Denham did not steal a medal at gunpoint. He failed to correct a stranger at a filling station in 1972, and then he failed to correct the next one. And by the time he was standing at a reception in 1974, telling his brother's story in the first person, the lie was the only thing holding the roof up, and Wilkes did not lie once. He just carried it, because a hot pan got handed to him at 28, and because his brother paid a bill in 1983 without being asked. That is the thing I want you to look at. An obligation you did not take on, that nobody ever put into words. That gets heavier every year precisely because it is never mentioned. That is the most expensive kind of debt there is, and almost every family has one. It is the sibling everybody is quiet around. It is the money that was never alone. It is the version of an old story that everybody knows is off by 10 degrees, and nobody adjusts, because adjusting it now would mean explaining why nobody adjusted it in 1988. And the reason those things last is that we mistake carrying them for loyalty. Wilkes Denham spent 50 years believing he was protecting his brother. He wasn't. He was protecting a decision he made at 28 when he was sick and broke and could not hold a hot pan, and every year after that he paid rent on it. The person he was actually protecting was the 28-year-old. Here is what a 9-year-old with a shoebox understood that a dozen adults did not. A question is not an accusation. Colson Weaver never accused his grandfather of anything. He wrote at the bottom of a 4th-grade poster board, "How do you find out which one is right?" And a whole structure that had survived 5 decades of love, holidays, funerals, and memorial days could not survive one child asking, politely, in writing, with a stamp on it. If a thing in your family cannot survive being asked about, not attacked, asked about, then it isn't a memory. It's a debt, and somebody is paying it, and it is probably not the person who took it on. You do not have to burn anything down. Wilkes Denham didn't. He just stopped signing. I'm Nathan.